You are listening to OBP.
Hey, everybody, this is Stephen Pohl, host of the Ohio Business Podcast. I'm joined with our lovely guest, Marisa Twigg of Matter News. Thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
You are listening to the Ohio Business Podcast, where we sit down and chat with today and tomorrow's business leaders of Ohio.
So kind of give a background story of Matter News. How big's your team? What's kind of the focus and the scope here?
Yeah, absolutely. So we founded in 2018, around November was kind of when we launched and started publishing. And so we are a nonprofit, independent investigative news outlet. So Gray Matter Media is our parent company, and they kind of have our nonprofit status. And so under that is Matter News. And so that is our nonprofit news publication. And so the way that we look at things is, rather than looking at, the way news is typically looked at is kind of this 24/7 news cycle, right? You just have things constantly happening on every kind of topic, right? So what we've elected to do is kind of, flip that model upside down and say, we're going to take a couple issues at a time and do a deep dive investigation in those things to provide a more holistic and comprehensive look at these issues that are affecting our city. And so within that, we have Crossing the Line, which is our policing investigation, which we just launched, and Develop Us, which is our investigation into city growth and development in Columbus in Central Ohio. So our team is about 3 full-time ladies. We have Cassie Young is a co-founder, Jalen Grisso, and those two originally met and were the 2 original co-founders. And then I came on last year. I can't remember exactly when I came on as a co-founder, but I was managing editor and came on as co-founder recently. So we are the 3 full-time folks. And then we just recently hired, which is really exciting. Our very first employee is Tommy Mead, and he is formerly the editor-in-chief at HBCU Buzz. And so he covered, historically Black colleges and universities, and from that perspective. And so he is coming on as our policing editor, which is really exciting. And then from there, we kind of have a bunch of different contributors who elect to, freelance stories for us. So that's kind of our model right now. Is having some editors and some freelancers. So yeah.
Great. So what was kind of the catalyst to get Matter News started? Because there's a lot of attitudes pointed at media and just news in general. What was kind of what brought you guys together to start Matter News?
Yeah, absolutely. So when Cassie and Jalen kind of met, so Cassie had worked in more of this kind of government research and policy field, as well as activism and organizing. And so she was kind of finding out that, people were learning these really intricate and kind of in-depth things more from her social media as she was diving into city ordinances, diving into city meetings and things like that. And people were seeing more of that coverage in a more engaging perspective, right, on Instagram. And so then, so she, doesn't have the background in journalism, but then she met Jalen Grisso, who she's worked for Mother Jones and Honolulu Civil Beat, which are, Honolulu Civil Beat is another nonprofit newsroom. And so she's worked from New York to Hawaii and places in between. And so when they met, they realized that, there is a lot of, problems in the journalism industry right now. And a lot of things, everywhere from bias to a lack of engagement to complete inaccessibility. I mean, paywalls, not everyone can afford a subscription to local news, right? And so after discussing many of these problems, they came together and decided to create Matter News and to take a local look to kind of bring a new perspective into journalism. So they decided to kind of look at, what are the traditional aspects of journalism that work, right? There are things that are really beneficial for our community. There are practices that we do that are, really helpful, but there are still some things that aren't quite as ethical and nor are they accessible for a lot of people. And so they came together and decided that, we really want to try to create more accessibility and engagement and civic engagement specifically in local news. The news is supposed to inform our idea about our community and expose what's going on in government institutions, corporate and private institutions, and hold those in power accountable. And so kind of figuring out the best way to bring the audience, to bring the reader, to bring the community member into that process was really at the core of what they wanted to do. And so to kind of do that, we had to create a whole new organization, right? And with a whole new set of ethics and guidelines that kind of guide our decisions. So, yeah.
Yeah, with the advent of the internet, it feels like local news and local news columnists and newspapers have just gone almost extinct, and it's been more of a focus on national news. And I feel like it's made everything seem, I don't know, more real when it's not really affecting you. And I think now that the internet's been around enough, people are trying to find a way to bring back the community. Through what you guys are doing, kind of what I'm doing with like Ohio Business Podcast, kind of make it more centralized niche just to your area. So you kind of build that community. And I think it was just we're kind of getting back to that stage where it's localized. I don't think print, I don't know about print, but definitely it's just some form of media. And don't you guys have a podcast?
So it's interesting. So we are working towards funding an investigative podcast about businesses and gentrification called Cornering Stores. But we're actually getting ready to launch through Gray Matter Media, not Matter News, what's called Unbreaking News. So we're trying to fill a gap in kind of the knowledge around the journalism industry, and provide people with real, raw, and tangible information about what problems the news industry faces. So I think it's something, I hope I don't butcher this stat, but I think around 40% of people, I'll have to double check that for you, around 40% of people believe that their newsrooms are totally fine, have no financial problems. That's a lot of people who think that like journalism organizations aren't struggling, and the majority of journalism organizations, unless you're the New York Times, unless you're the LA Times or the Washington Post, are struggling. You talked about, you're seeing kind of local news disappear. That's media consolidation, right? And we're seeing Gannett and Gatehouse, these two of the United States' largest media companies are buying up all these local newsrooms and putting them all into, one company and one newsroom. And so even here in Columbus, a lot of the newsrooms that have different names are under the same umbrella of the Dispatch Media Group and Gannett and Gatehouse. So, the Columbus Dispatch, Columbus CEO, Columbus Alive, they're all a part of the same company. But you would think that they're separate companies because they all have different names, right? But that means that they're all sharing resources too, and are strapped for those resources because they're kind of competing. So I think I'm straying away from your original question a bit, so apologies.
No, you're fine. What was I going to say? But so you guys are working on investigative podcast. That would be great. Just in the surrounding Columbus area.
Yeah, so the Cornering Stores investigative podcast, it follows a woman named Aiden Tesfaye. She is an immigrant from Eritrea, and she owned this business called Natalia's Carryout in Wineland Park. And so folks who are familiar with that area will know that, it's had some instances of, some crime there. And Wineland Park had a lot of instances of crime and gentrification, and those two things often go hand in hand. As you're seeing rising home prices, as you're seeing new developments coming in, you're also going to see new attitudes in the neighborhood change as newcomers come into this area and have different perspectives about how their community should look and should run. You also are bringing more wealth into an area that historically was redlined, right? And so this specific story of Aiden Tesfaye looks at how her business, her corner store, was targeted in this neighborhood. The police sent in multiple undercover cops to see if they were selling alcohol to underage folks. And so in several instances, they were selling alcohol to underage folks. What our question is exploring is, why does this specific business get targeted so much when just blocks up the street? So this is at the corner of 6th Street and Summit, literally right across from Wineland Park on Summit Street. And so, several blocks up the street, you have OSU campus area, right? I was an Ohio State student. you know that they're very well serving underage people there, but those bars are not getting shut down. So why is this specific business being targeted in this neighborhood? That business she was actually sued, and so the business went under. She didn't own the business; she rented out the property to another business owner, so she wasn't really attached to the business, just the property. But she specifically was sued because it was her property, and so.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So because there were some environmental regulations that were an issue too. So the building was a bit dilapidated, you know, is kind of falling apart, and so there are some of those issues in there as well. So it explores a whole bunch of stuff, right? But why is she being targeted when, you know, specifically in this police instance? So looking at the role of changing demographics in a neighborhood, how that relates to crime and gentrification. So that's really what that podcast aims to explore. And that is still in the works because being a small nonprofit newsroom, we have very limited resources. Last year was the first year we were able to fundraise, and we raised $15,000, which is really exciting. So that's why we were able to hire our first employee and put him on the policing investigation. But for the Quartering Stores podcast, we really want to be able to pay people to work on that full time and get it out, because it's a series that's going to take a lot of work and a lot of reporting, and it's just not something we're able to kind of bootstrap at the moment, like some of our other projects and content. So that's kind of where we stand with that. But it's something that when I first got started in Matter in 2018, that was one of the core projects that I was running and working on. But ultimately we decided we really want to be able to pay people for this and you know, build out the organization a little bit more before we kind of like put that out there. So there's a page where we talk about it and list all the information. We have a Q&A section about it. And we actually have a specific fund for that. So if people are interested in seeing that project come to fruition and seeing kind of the underrepresented story of an immigrant in Columbus owning a business and seeing that get shut down in a neighborhood that is undergoing so much change, you know, that is something that we're looking to fund. So
Yeah, check it out, people. But you know, Columbus is just every time I drive around, you just see these massive apartment complexes for young people and students or what have you. And sooner or later, those people are going to stay here, get jobs here, and then there's only so many homes, and then they're going to buy all these homes. And I think I think it's already a really good real estate market, but it's just going to be even more so 5-10 years from now. And it's going to be a radical change in demographics and just neighborhoods for sure.
No, absolutely.
And then how has fundraising been going? What have you guys been doing to raise money?
Yeah, so COVID-19 has brought on a slew of problems for us as everyone else, right? So a couple of our ways that we fundraise, you know, community events are a big one. We like to throw events that kind of bring the community together in a way that is both educational, informative, and engaging. So, you know, we've done everything from like creating a local news scavenger hunt where you kind of go across city. And so this was actually at a music festival called Cloud City, if you're familiar with that. They threw their first one last year in Columbus. And, you know, from that to, you know, we've tabled at ComFest and things like that, but also, you know, the basic ways looking through for grants and things like that. But the primary way that we are funded is actually through the people. So we are nonprofit, right? And so we kind of follow an NPR based model where we are community funded. We get donations from community members, and sustaining members are the greatest way to help make sure that we can do this for years to come. And so what's been interesting is that as a young nonprofit, and as young leaders ourselves, I mean, I am going to be 25, Jaylyn is 25, and Cassie is 30. So we, you know, we're still in the younger group of folks starting this. You don't think to ask as much, you know, to ask for what you want. But this summer we've been experimenting with asking for what we need more. And the community has just saw such value in what we're doing that we have been receiving so much love and support and donations, which is something that I could not be happier about, that people are benefiting from this and see the value in investing in an investigative, local, independent news source like Matter. So it's been going pretty well. We're gearing up for Newsmatch, which Newsmatch is a 2-month-long campaign in November and December where every donation is matched dollar for dollar. So that's kind of something we're gearing up for right now and preparing for, getting a lot of that stuff ready, and connecting with other nonprofit newsrooms because nonprofit news is growing each year. There's over 200 nonprofit newsrooms across the United States, and there's several here in Ohio, so which is really neat to see.
How important do you think is that nonprofit status compared to, that paywall ad subscription model?
So for me, I think ethics plays a big role in this, and
you would think, right? You
would think. Right? And so,
you would hope so.
Yeah, exactly, right? You would hope, right? And so, our perspective firmly from the bottom of our hearts is that governments and corporations make it difficult enough for us everyday people to get access to what they're doing, what they're putting in our water, how they're building our homes, what's in the air we breathe, what our police are doing, what are even the rules and ordinances that exist that create these structures, right, in our society. And so governments and corporations make it so difficult to figure that out already. Why should journalists gatekeep that information even more by barring access, especially for people with lower incomes, right? I was not raised in a family that had a lot of disposable income. We could not afford subscriptions to local news, let alone things like Netflix. I mean, not that Netflix existed when I was, a child, but, so things like that, we truly don't believe that, you should be barred access from that. And so for us, the nonprofit model is so important to the ethics and accessibility and is absolutely key to civic engagement. So a new study from Gallup just came out, Gallup and the Knight Foundation, which they are really big in journalism. And so this new study came out this summer that said that, I was steamrolling and just lost my train of thought.
Well, the Gallup poll about paywall versus nonprofit. And then,
yes, civic engagement. That's where I was going. Okay. Thank you. I appreciate it. So civic engagement. So they found that people who read local news are more likely to vote in any election. And so that shows that the more engaged that they are with what's happening in their local community, they're more likely to be civically engaged in their community and to care about the democracy of what's happening in that area. And so if people don't have access to that local news, they're not going to be engaged with what's happening in their community, right? They're not going to know about what's going on because, I clicked this article that says, hey, police misconduct, investigation, but I can't even read this because I have to pay $5 a month just to see this. I can't afford that. But guess what? Let's say you're a Black woman living in Linden and you want to know what's going on because your children are affected by this, you're affected by this, but you can't get access to that information because you've got to be strategic about where you put your money. You're not going to pay for that. And so, and so making sure that underrepresented folks are both heard and able to access this information is important because everyone deserves to be able to be informed and play a role in their democracy if that's what they want to do. So for us, that nonprofit is so important.
Do you think local news is probably the most expensive news to obtain?
I'm not entirely sure. I haven't actually done the research to look at, various subscription model types. I would say, I don't want to give you a definite answer because I'm not sure on the actual numbers, but I would say that when you go to bigger news organizations like, the New York Times or the Washington Post, there are other add-ons that you can get that end up making it more costly. So let's say you want the more lifestyle stuff, or you want something that's, a very niche topic, you're going to be able to pay for stuff like that. Whereas a local news organization oftentimes doesn't have the ability to provide a niche product because they are responding to things as they're going on and doing some investigations, right? But they're not able to offer you that additional stuff. Now, not everyone wants that, right? So to answer your question, I'm not really sure entirely on which is really more expensive, but I would say that it really depends on your locality and kind of what, how you would base. Yeah. I'm just going to end with, I'm not entirely sure. Because
I love that point you made about how if you're more engaged in your community, you're more likely to vote. And that's, you're going to see the change in your community. If you make those decisions will change your day to day. And I wish more people weren't so just obsessed with national news, because who cares about what's going on in California? The people in DC don't care about what's going on here. They just don't care realistically, but the people in your community should at least be trying to care. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like the politicians at least. So
No.
that's so important that you guys are trying to do, especially investigative journalism. That's probably my favorite. I like, you break some crazy stories, but I love what you told me. I love what you guys are doing. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. I kind of want to talk about, you brought up this like national news thing a lot, and I think that's really important to touch on, because when I talked about media consolidation earlier, you're taking all of these local news sites that exist in an area, in a region, and you're consolidating them into one. And so what happens, so Gannett owns what is called USA Today, and they are the organization, what you see when you click the links for these different websites, right, for these different news organizations. And so the Dispatch partners with USA Today, and they're technically a subsidiary under that, right? And so they're all sharing national stories. There are some days I will get an email from the Columbus Dispatch, and the first story is a national story that really doesn't have anything to do with Ohio. But I subscribe to the Columbus Dispatch, but the first story I'm getting is not relevant to my community, right? And so what you're seeing with all this media consolidation is that these news sites, they're funded by ads, right? And so this is where that ethics comes into play again. So at the end of the day, when you are funded by ads, you need people to click your stories to get that revenue, right? And so you are putting out content that is going to get you clicks, because at the end of the day, you have bills to pay, and you have investors and shareholders that need to turn a profit on their investments in the news company. So that's how a lot of these corporate newsrooms and consolidated newsrooms are funded, is by hedge funds and investors. And so they need to get their shares, they need to get their share of the profit, right? Which is how that model works. But the ethics in that end up being that you are publishing content that is going to get you clicks rather than serving your community. And so that is where you get into this idea of what is journalism? Is journalism a product, or is journalism a public good? And so when you have a nonprofit model, you get to look at it more as a public good rather than a product, because the goal isn't necessarily to get as many clicks as you can, right? And the goal is to get people to read and understand what's happening in their community, because our content our funding model doesn't rely on people clicking on our story for us to get paid. Our content, for us to get paid, it relies on people believing in the cause and the mission of an informed and civically engaged community that can sustain that civic engagement. And so when you get that consolidated news, national stories, our country is so polarized right now that like you said, people think that the national news is going to have an effect on them right there. Anything Trump says, oh, I'm going to get mad about that, right? And I fall into that trap a lot of the times too, and people latch on to that, and it's an emotional response that you can get out of that as well. But when you can, mass publish a national story about something, a federal politician said, you can get those clicks across the country. But if you're this massive company that's, you're not going to focus as much on the local news, because that's not going to have value across the board. So you have to, and again, I don't want to paint broad strokes about this, because it's obviously not everywhere, but this is the trend that is being seen. National news is taking over a lot of local issues. And so to combat that, a lot of nonprofit news sites that are being started these days, and I will say a majority of them are digital, because we see that newspapers, it is so hard to keep a sustainable profit and turn sustainable revenue when you're publishing a paper. It's just not. The advertising has all gone to Google and Facebook. Over 70% of that advertising that local news publishers used to get is now going to the internet, right? Because people see that ROI, that return on investment from those ads, better than they do in the newspaper. So that funding is gone. So nonprofit news orgs are turning to digital. And And a lot of what I'm trying to get at is that nonprofit news orgs end up being more local in coverage area than national. Local as in, you know, even there are some neighborhood focused, like in Chicago, there are several news organizations that cover districts and neighborhood blocks within Chicago. Here in Columbus, we have I in Ohio, and they are a statewide nonprofit news organization that we sometimes partner with. And so you have like very specific regions versus these just covering kind of everything with nonprofit news. Mm-hmm. Which I'm not saying that, you know, corporate media doesn't do that. It definitely has local news things, but they're being consolidated at much higher rates.
I feel for that pay for click model, it's more entertainment. Like you are just feeding people their biases. And then what you guys are doing is, you know, engaging the reader. They are learning. You're informing them. You know, it's a totally different structure. And pay for click, it's just eyeballs. We all want to read the headline. You know, it's just you have to. Like it's like you have to almost click. And it's just creating more rabbit holes as people just digest information differently. And I don't know, but I don't know. What do you think about the toxic headlines just being promoted, you know, on just with pay for click?
I think it's really interesting that you bring that up because actually just last night, and I think, where did I put my phone? Here it is. So sorry. So actually just yesterday, caveat, we often use the Columbus Dispatch as kind of having a lot of examples that we like to bring about because they have faced a lot of these issues, right? Their staff has been furloughed. They've seen budget cuts. They've seen people who have, had to take severance packages and leave the company, you know, because Gannett has slashed their budgets, right? I mean, so they fall into a lot of these problems. And so one of the, you know, when you're talking about these, headline issue. So yesterday, the Dispatch posted a story about the press conference that happened 2 days ago with the Baker and Hostetler investigation into police misconduct over the protests that happened this summer. And so their story had said, their headline was, "Investigation into possible misconduct by Columbus police during protests finds little misconduct." But in their tweet, they say little misconduct found in protest response by Columbus police. That's not the full story. And so I went on to say, so another statistic to kind of throw out there is around 60% of people only read the headline of the story, right? The majority of people are only reading the headlines. And I get it. Listen, I'm a journalist. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world today. It is hard to find the time to read about everything that you care about or you should care about or you want to care about, right? So it's difficult. You try to skim what you can and click on what you can. But in those instances, news publishers know that the majority of people are only reading the headline. That's why they make it such a deal to make these clickable headlines that people want to click, right? And we all have to play into that game a little bit. But this headline, you know, little misconduct found in protest response by Columbus police, 60% of people are going to see that and think that a very specific thing happened downtown, that there just wasn't police misconduct that happened. When in reality, the article about halfway down goes on to say that many of the police officers failed to uphold their standard operating procedure of filling out use of force paperwork after use of force or excessive use of force was completed. Now, the headline doesn't tell you that at all. It doesn't tell you that one of the biggest reasons why the investigators could not figure out why, you know, what these police misconduct was because they did not file the paperwork. The second biggest reason, also halfway down the story, is that these investigators couldn't even identify the officers because of riot gear equipment blocking all badges and names, just because videos and photos could not provide, you know, hair color. You know, they have bike helmets on and masks and glasses. So there were something like 35 complaints that they had tried to investigate. Only one of those was sustained. And the majority of them, they were not sustained because of
and
those.
that was the headline. That one was like that little misconduct kind of.
was found. Little misconduct
okay.
was found in by Columbus police, right? But the
That
story,
is such a weird headline, though. It seems
right?
like the reverse is like, I feel like there's a better headline where you get more just from a pay-per-click model. I feel like you could rewrite that headline to get more people to look at that. You know,
Yeah.
I don't know. That's just weird, but yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. And so I think it's exploitative of people to to me, it's a half truth, right? Yes, you can say that the investigation found little misconduct, but that's because they couldn't sustain anything because they couldn't actually investigate those instances.
Exactly.
So you're not telling the full story, and 60% of people are going to get a half truth. And to me, that's unethical.
That's crazy. I don't. That just doesn't make sense. Why? I feel like there's a better story in saying that there's misrepresentation or whatever. But I don't know. I don't write the news, but
hey, well, there's also a lot to be said about the kind of establishment, but also legacy of the Dispatch in this city. And the way that they report on certain topics. I've spoken to many readers who believe that that the Columbus Dispatch leans a little conservatively in terms of coverage. You can see that in some of their past reporting on drug policy issues regarding marijuana legalization and decriminalization, and the way that headlines are written about that. Like one of those headlines when there was talk a few years ago about the decriminalization of marijuana in Columbus. The headline for the story about the decriminalization bill going in or policy going in for Columbus was, and this was after it had passed, and the headline was essentially you'll pay more for an expired parking meter than I think it's 300 grams of marijuana.
yeah, it was a lot, like a pound or two. Wasn't it a lot or something? Yeah.
Yeah, it was a huge amount. I can't remember, the amount.
That story.
Yeah, and so it was the headline was totally, it was written for someone who is going to be upset that now I have to pay more for an expired parking meter than some person smoking weed is going to pay for having marijuana. So that's priming someone who thinks like that to click that story, right? But the whole story is actually about how disproportionate it is for the whole conversation around that policy was about how the criminalization of marijuana is racist because people of color and Black people specifically are jailed more for marijuana use, even though research shows that people of color and white folks use marijuana at the same rates. So the whole conversation, then you're elevating that, you're pivoting that whole conversation to the expired parking meter and the marijuana. Although it is a snappy and really interesting fact, right? And it is kind of clickbaity, but clickbaity for who, right? When the whole story is really about the racial inequity of marijuana criminalization. And so that's how those perspectives can be spun in some of those stories, right?
It's always tilted. It's always tilted. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even when, you think it isn't, it sometimes can be. And that's why, as news consumers, we have to be really critical. And that's why critical about the things we're reading. And so that's one of the reasons why we've started that Unbreaking News podcast. And there's a blog on Medium called Unbreaking News too, because we want to show people the reality of what's happening in journalism and what the problems are that are in journalism and really how we are trying to fix some of those issues. It's going to take a long time, right? We're not going to fix it in a day. And when we first started Matter, we had looked at it, as a revolution. We thought we were revolutionizing the news and, overthrowing a system and yada, yada, yada. But no, really what we're doing is we're taking what works in traditional journalism and using carefully crafted changes that are that are very 2020, that are very both reaching young folks and old, senior folks, because you have to be able to reach those audiences and meet them where they're at, right? We're taking what works in the old ways of journalism and what's working in news publishing, digital news now, kind of merging that with an ethical approach.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, if you want to make a big change, you got to take it day by day, week by week. So
yeah,
the news is I'm surprised those big. I've been watching Vice struggle. They're fairly new too, and they kind of revolutionized a lot. But they've been struggling. BuzzFeed's the same way. They've had massive layoffs. It's strange just because they were game changers in 2016.
Yeah.
And now they're seeing layoffs, but I don't know. I think they just had hard models to sustain, but
yeah, and there's a bunch of different. So some people have pointed to the role of federal funding in news and state funding in news, and now some news organizations are really not okay with that because they don't want any perception that the state or the government is having an influence on coverage. Others are media. Like, that it could be state run, and that the perception from people could be, well, you're funded by the state, so you're going to have the perspective of the state. And others are like, we need the money. Like, we want to do these investigations, and we want to be able to support our community, and we need the money to do that. Other people take a little bit more nuanced approach and say, hey, the only way we're going to do this is if we get editorial independence and that you play no role in the selection or curation of whatever content we produce. And so there's a lot of different schools of thought on, what that solution would look like as a way to fund news.
So I'm a finance guy. I read I've been reading finance news I read the garbage of Yahoo Finance to Barron's, which is like, in my opinion, the best finance news out there. But I read everything in between to the conspiracy theories of whatnot and what have you. But I feel like there's so much financial journalism, at least, where the journalists they really don't know what they're talking about. And then I would literally go into their background. Like I would go to their LinkedIn page to see like what their career was, their background, or whatever it was. And it was absolutely no finance, like business related at all. Do you kind of see that in any other type of news reporting or anything along those lines?
Yeah, definitely. So I have a couple things to add about that. So yeah, we definitely see that across the industry. So in a lot of newsrooms, you change your beat. So what a reporter covers is called a beat. So whatever topic you're covering is called a beat. So just a little journalism lingo for your day. And so those beat reporters are often on a cycle. So you don't get stuck covering the same thing. So you'll have a cops reporter, you'll have, a finance reporter, you'll have a health, or occasionally, if you're lucky and can afford it, an environment reporter, And so eventually those people end up all switching. Now, some things like an environment reporter require some specific expertise, but a lot of times newsrooms, especially small local newsrooms, can't afford to pay for super specific expertise and coverage. So they get people who can really report really well, right? And so they end up switching a lot of these beats and changing their beats kind of often. I would say every couple of months, potentially. It really varies on the newsroom. And so you see these people who are bouncing from topic to topic. And when I was in college, so I went to school for environmental policy and studied environmental and social justice and kind of those intersections there, and journalism. I was trying to go for both degrees. Ultimately, I couldn't afford both. So I took a lot of journalism classes, but I ultimately got a bachelor's of science in the environmental policy because my dream job someday is to work for National Geographic as a reporter there, covering the environment and social issues and things like that. But it's always been my philosophy, and what I've heard from a lot of long-term career journalists is that you should really get an understanding of what you want to cover, what you're passionate about covering, so you can know that topic in and out and be able to explain that in a way that everyone can understand. Because what a lot of times can happen is if you're not really familiar, like if I were to go and report on medical stuff, I would be terrible because I don't know much about the medical field. I am not well versed in the lingo. I would really have to ask a lot of questions to break down the language there. But if I had a background knowledge of the medical field already, I'd be able to break down that and then figure out how to communicate that in a way that makes sense to the layperson. And so another reason why we do the deep dive model at Matter and look into specific topics at a time, so that way our reporters and our contributors who are focused on these investigations, they're able to get a more holistic and comprehensive understanding of the topic they're covering. They're not switching from beat to beat, or story to story, because a lot of times you also have general assignment reporters who are just working on anything their editor sends them, like, oh, hey, this meeting's happening today. We don't have anyone to cover it. We need you to go cover it. Oh, hey, this press release just came out about this new Wendy's burger, which has been stories that I have seen in this city. Not exactly the most important thing that we need to know about is the new maple glazed bacon sandwich from Wendy's, right? But we still see those stories pop up because someone's got to cover it, and Wendy's, is here in Columbus. So long story short, you see a lot of this kind of happening, this general news assignment. So anyways, getting back to kind of what we do at Matter, we want our reporters to have an in-depth background about what they're covering. So many of our reporters who've reported for Develop Us, our development investigation, have studied, regional and city planning. They've studied, for me, I've looked into community development and housing and how poverty plays a role in gentrification and things like that. And so being able to have that background of these social dynamics and these economic dynamics is really important, and helps not only make you understand the information, but helps you as a reporter communicate that information in a way that makes sense and is more contextualized to your reader. That's the whole, important thing about investigations is you're taking what you see happening in the streets and on the ground every day, and you're bridging that with, okay, here are the policies, the government decisions that have created these situations and incidences that we're seeing today. And so that's really why we take that kind of deep dive model, and why we're not, just assigning kind of beats here and there and general news here and there. So, yeah.
As a journalist, where would you say you spend your most time?
Oh, can you be a little more can you clarify that a little bit more? Like spend time, like what, in terms of spend where, like?
I don't know, like throughout your week, like right now, throughout your week, what is the most, where do you spend the most time? Like, what are you doing the most? Are you researching? Are you writing, are you managing?
That's okay. I see what you mean now. So, it's definitely, so as a co-founder, I wear probably like 20 different hats. We all work on everything from marketing to engagement to finances and funding. But for me, my role is Develop Us editor. So I spearhead our development investigation. And I'm also managing editor, so I kind of help manage contributors and things like that. And so the majority of my time is torn between, I also do I do all of our social media. I don't create all of the posts, but I create a good majority of them and schedule them and do all that management there. So I'd say between social media and right now finances, but also managing our contributors. So I do a lot of editing of stories. At the moment, I'm not doing a ton of writing, but I am working on a video piece right now about the low-income housing tax credit. So it's a mix really between creating content, editing content, and running this organization, really. So yeah, I don't know if that doesn't really directly answer your question because it's more than one thing, but
Hey, it's okay. What would you say right now is your organization's biggest expense?
Personnel. So after our News Match campaign last year, so we were operating from 2018 until from 2018, all of 2018, all of 2019 on a complete volunteer basis. For those 2 years, none of us co-founders got paid, none of our writers got paid, and everyone was just there for the mission, which was really beautiful. So everyone came together because they believe in what we are creating for this city. And so at the end of the day, personnel is our biggest expense, which is something we have just in 2020 been able to start paying, which is really exciting for us because as a startup, you got to get that money from somewhere. And if you want to grow, you need to be able to pay people to work on your projects, right? It's just business 101. So that's been our biggest expense. And it is hard because we want to be able to get dedicated people in here, and not everyone is willing or able, to kind of hustle their way through this, right? In the startup community, you oftentimes have to find side hustles and work multiple jobs to really get it through. So our biggest expense is personnel, because we really want to be able to get more people producing content. Eventually, one of our next goals is to either get someone in a finance position, so we can kind of get back to producing and creating content and managing our contributors rather than focusing on that, and also hiring a full-time reporter outside of us. We have the editor, and we need people in those kind of managerial roles, but it'd be amazing to have a full-time reporter that could work for us too. So that's definitely our biggest expense.
Where do you guys see the biggest user base coming from? Social media, the website, blogs, just what platform?
Yeah, so Instagram has been our biggest thing so far for a couple of reasons. One, our co-founder Cassie Young has kind of a big, kind of extensive network on there. Two, when we pivot our coverage this summer to the racial justice and policing of protests, I was going down there almost every single day and getting on Instagram Live and showing people what was going on. And so originally we were only doing our development investigation, looking into city growth, right? And then Cassie and I and Jaylyn had gone out on our own personal platforms, just being freelancers essentially, and started just live streaming what was happening and just narrating what we were seeing and what was going on. And what we saw was that what we were seeing and showing people on our live streams was not what was being reported in the news. We were getting the police perspective, right? We were getting what was on the record on police reports, right? We weren't getting the actual visualness of what's happening. People didn't get to look and see for themselves what was going on. And so that's the gap that we kind of filled in that instance. And when, people started saying, oh, Matter News is covering this, go tune into Matter News, when it was just me, Cassie, and Jaylyn. And so we just decided we need to fill this gap right now. And so we pivoted our resources, and I was going down there every day. And that's how Instagram ended up becoming our biggest platform, is because we were just going live and we were just showing people, look, this is what is happening. This is what protesters are doing, and you can see that. And this is what the police are doing, and you can see that. Rather than reading a secondhand account from us, we were showing them, just letting them decide for themselves. And that, I think, is also an important part of journalism, is allowing people to see, how often are you giving the mic to other people? How often are you letting people decide for themselves what is going on in the community, rather than you making the decisions about what story needs to be told? You get to show them what's happening and let them kind of react to that in a sense. So I think that kind of coverage is also important. So long story short, Instagram is kind of our biggest user base right now, which is really great in a way, because it allows such personal engagement. Like, I've had conversations with people from our brand account, but just having conversations. And so many people have never had a conversation. I think it's something like 80% of people have never had a conversation with a journalist. We need to change that, because
this is my first one, so.
Oh, hello. But yeah, it's so important for journalists to be accessible in their community, because they are the gatekeepers of information. We are the ones telling people what's going on. And, there are other ways, there's a lot of citizen journalism that also happens in the community, which is very important to information sharing in a community, right? And so citizen journalism is like citizens and residents going out and kind of doing their own reporting, which you see a lot in these instances where you have people going out and live streaming protests and things like that and whatnot. So, sorry, what was your original question?
Well, you answered it. Instagram.
Yeah.
You growing your user base, but it was very interesting to see the mainstream media report the protests and just COVID in general, because it's just seemed both sides were just so blatantly it was just so biased. It was just disturbing. It was like, oh my God, you really can't listen to these people, like Fox News, CNN specifically. It was, I don't know. It was just so hard to watch. I don't know. But,
yeah, no, those two in particular, are very, and it's funny. My dad often brings this comparison. I think, that you could be watching the same story and flip between CNN and Fox, and it's just completely different, right? And so you see that a lot of times. And there's these really great graphs that are like these, little graphs that show you like, is this left wing? Is this right wing? Is this, like where is it in terms of ethics and whatnot? And so there are a lot of really interesting graphs out there that can help you be more informed about the sources that you're using and which ones are more centerline. But you're gonna find, so this is one of the biggest issues in journalism, right? There's this whole idea of objectivity. And the notion of objectivity that people see today and think that journalism is supposed to have today is that the reporter is supposed to be free of bias. The reporter is supposed to be objective, right? That has been completely misconstrued. When objectivity was first brought about in journalism, it wasn't about the reporter. It was always about the process. The process of journalism is supposed to be objective. There is no way that I, as a woman, can remove my personal, whatever I think about how women are treated, how women get opportunities or don't. I can't remove that from my brain because I've experienced it. I've had lived experience. Black folks have had lived experiences that are going to inform the way they operate in life. But that does not change the way that we engage in the process of journalism. We still talk to the people that we need to talk to and get the information that we need to get from whatever sides we need to. But there are also instances where you see, in that, the process is supposed to be objective. The fact checking, the information gathering, the sourcing, who you're getting information from, and the way you put that information together is supposed to be objective. And the person is obviously supposed to remove their biases from that. But your biases, so if I'm investigating a story about women, right, let's just use that for an example. Let's say, like sexual assault or something. In women's experience, in my experience, things like that have happened. And how am I going to remove myself from that? It's going to inform my investigation and make me think about it in a different way, right? There was Alexis Johnson was a journalist, can't remember at the publication at the moment, but she was a Black journalist who was barred by her newspaper from covering the protests because she was Black. And how those folks are often left out of that discussion. And so in that instance, those editors are saying, you're biased because you're Black. You can't cover this protest because you're Black, which is kind of
say the same thing about, like, I don't know, you can't cover the protest because you're white. Like, it goes both ways. So, or
like, you played hockey in high school, so why would you cover hockey now? Like that, yeah. How is that not? We don't see that as bias. We see that as bolstering your reporting because you have knowledge about that sport, right? But that gets back to this idea of objectivity, and there's this other aspect to objectivity, and there's a lot of W.E.B. Du Bois wrote an essay. He's a Black writer, journalist, author, I believe in the 50s. I could really be getting my timeline off. But essentially, maybe it was the 1800s. Don't quote me on that. Don't quote the journalist on that one. But he was writing about objectivity, and he was tasked with writing a journal entry for the encyclopedia on the Black man in America. Wrote a whole bunch of stuff that, was about that experience. And so essentially they told him, well, you can't write about this thing and this thing. And they removed a lot of the instances, like lived experiences about ways that Black people were barred from voting. They took out the specific number of lynchings that happened. And so they lessened the impact and the actual facts of the lived experience of Black folks at that time, because the objective was a white neutral. Objectivity is supposed to have this idea of neutrality, right? But it has always been centered on white people. And white people have always decided what the center and what objective and what neutrality looks like. So as a white people, as white people in power, and a lot of news organizations are run by white men, and they have these specific perspectives about what objectivity and what neutrality looks like. And so that's why you see people like Alexis Johnson, who didn't get to write about the protest. They, after a ton of backlash, rescinded that, of course. But so you see this idea about objectivity is supposed to be about the reporter, but really it's about the process. And it's always come from this very white center, because that is the narrative that is dominant in this society, because the gatekeepers of our information have always been white. And that's something that we think about a lot at Matter, because we are 3 white women, 3 white presenting women who run this organization, right? We decided to, our first paid employee is Tommy, and he's a Black man, and he's covering this, and we wanted to be able to, put that community in a position of power to make those decisions about this coverage, because we're not the most informed, and also we can't. It's important to put folks in power who have historically been disenfranchised, right? And so it's just super important to do that, and to help be both anti-racist and take away that objective white neutral the objectivity that is often the white neutral. So I think I'm kind of
you guys, you talked about it and you're doing it, so that's great.
Doing our best, trying.
I mean, it's a difficult process, and you got to play that line. So that's awesome.
Thanks.
Last question as we wrap up. Where do you see news headed, and where do you see Matter News in the future?
Wow. Big questions for the last one. So really, I do see news expanding into it. I see news expanding into more multimedia options. I see, Vox is like kind of our big example. They have this beautiful Explained series on Netflix, and that's like, oh, news is on Netflix now, and it's engaging, it's interesting, people are into that. And so we're just seeing these new ways of connecting. You have Washington Post TikTok guy, like you have news people on TikTok, trying to reach audiences where they're at, trying to meet people where they're at and connect with them in ways that they want to be connected with. People don't want, young folks especially don't want cut and dry news. They want it to be engaging. They want it to matter to them and to be meaningful to them and to be fun in a way. They don't want everything to be doom and gloom, right? And what's interesting is that in that Gallup study, it found that young people are actually the most likely to pay for news, to pay for local news. And that blew my mind, that young folks are really seeing that value. And older folks aren't necessarily seeing that value at this point. But I think that's because, anyways, I'm straying from the point. Let me get back to the point. I have a history of doing that. So I think that news is headed towards accessibility. I think it's headed for a complete overhaul of its ethics. I think people are, especially with these social uprisings, these racial uprisings, and this new kind of, not new, but this continued civil rights movement that we're seeing, right? These problems aren't new. As our elders have showed us, they've been happening for decades and centuries, right? So I think we're going to see an ethics reckoning happening in the newsroom, and I think that people are going to play a really big role in that. I think the everyday person is going to play a really big role in that, because with the election coverage that happened in 2016, people are really upset over the way that has influenced and had a role in kind of the way that election was perceived, right? And so people are really trying not to make those same mistakes this year, but you have to do the work to not make those same mistakes. So for Matter News, where we're headed was your question, or where I see it in the future?
Yes.
So down the road, we'd love to open many investigations and turn, on different issues that are founded with community input. So we're actually applying for a grant right now called the New Neiman's Grant Fellowship, where we want to create a community news integrity model that allows newsrooms, that creates a scalable model for newsrooms to proactively elicit feedback and engage their community in the editorial process and figure out, okay, in your perspective and in your neighborhood community, your local, whatever community looks like to you. What are the most pressing issues facing your community? What do you need information about? And creating a scalable model that allows newsrooms to figure out how to best both get that information about what their community needs covered and needs reported on, and uplift underrepresented voices who often don't get a seat at the table. And so that's a big thing that we want to do is use that community feedback to open multiple investigations at once to provide holistic and comprehensive investigative coverage of these situations. Many years down the road, this year, we hadn't predicted that we were going to open a second investigation until 2025. So yeah, and it happened this year. We hadn't predicted that we were going to be on payroll until next year. And a lot of that stuff has happened much sooner. So I think that we're going to grow a little bit faster than we thought we would, which is exciting. But yeah, we hope to expand in the future to multiple investigations.
As we wrap up, any words of wisdom to either young startup minded people or journalists out there?
To startup folks, do your best to take care of you, because at the end of the day, your startup, your business, your community, whatever niche you're trying to fill, whatever need you're trying to fill needs you, and they need all of you. So you've got to show up for yourself. And this is also like to myself, because oftentimes, and especially in this pandemic, it is so hard to get bogged down with all of these tasks and to feel like you're not doing enough. But at the end of the day, you've got to fill your bucket, because you're the one bringing this journey, this product, this experience, whatever it is you're creating to fruition. And you've got to be able to show up for yourself before you can show up for that. So that's kind of my advice to startups. To journalists, think about your role in your newsroom and how you can question authority and hold your newsroom accountable to the ethics and interests and morals that you have and that you want to see in your community. I think a lot of times, especially for young journalists, it can be hard to stand up to things that you might see as wrong, or not necessarily wrong, but not entirely right. Things that you don't see as good for your community. It can be hard to stand up to an editor and say, hey, I actually think we should talk about it in this way because we're actually stereotyping this group or whatever, So being able to hold your ground and know that your input is valuable to your community because you're covering this, and your ethics and morals come into play too.
Beautifully said. Now, how can the people find you and Matter News?
Yes. So you can find me on Twitter. That's probably my primary place, at Twigg. I need to change it, but RIS.
Oh yeah, sorry, because I'm gonna follow you. So. Oh,
awesome! Yeah, no worries. I used to go by Riss, and then I went back to Marisa. So just a long story there. But Twigg, RISTWIGG is my Twitter. And Matter News you can find on most platforms, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Matter News _. And our website is matternews.org. So please check us out. We just relaunched our website. So it is, we'd love any feedback you have. And yeah, check us out. We really try to, be accessible on all platforms and tell a different kind of a story on all of our social media. So you're not getting kind of the same content everywhere. But yeah, that's where you can find us.
Marisa Twigg, Matter News, thanks for coming on. That was amazing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I really appreciate this. It was a great conversation.
The Ohio Business Podcast is sponsored by Jansen Media. Jansen Media is a website design and digital marketing agency. They develop custom strategies and solutions around client goals and business objectives. From day one, they have been focused on results, building websites that deliver more online traffic, more conversions, better user experience, easy navigation, and web functionality. You can find Jansen Media on their website at jansenmedia.com. That's spelled JANSCEN media.com. That's jansenmedia.com. Thanks. I want to introduce you guys to the Ohio Business Podcast first sponsor, Nextdoor. Want to earn extra cash with your extra space? There's an app for that, to Nextdoor, the marketplace for your storage space. Nextdoor is currently taking on new hosts like me. Simply visit their site, nextdoor.com, nxtstor.com, to get the app. Just think what an extra $200 a month can mean to you by simply storing your friends' boxes and mattresses. Once again, check out nextdoor.com. Thanks.